Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leung Wei Lun, but to people who know me, I'm more commonly known as Byron Leong. I'm a family law partner at Lander and Rogers. I'm a first-generation Australian-born child of Chinese parents, where I grew up in Far North Queensland in the 1980s in the very stereotypical Chinese restaurant. As much as I am proud of being an Asian Australian, I sadly share similar stories as Matt of discrimination and prejudices growing up, where I felt the need to suppress my cultural identity. When I first started my legal career, I was fortunate to join a firm that actually encouraged me to embrace, I'll use the term, my Asianness. This encouragement then helped my confidence grow for me to be who I really was. My encouragement to accept my culture, without a doubt, helped me in my chosen legal field of family law. Over the years, I realised that many young and talented Asian lawyers did not have the encouragement that I had, and this then drew me to the work being done by AILA. So thank you to Gavin, Joanna, Jim, and Amber, to a wonderful start to our summit by sharing your experiences. And what was encouraging was the fact that we had 3 law students who are articulating and advocating for change. I would now like to welcome for the ministerial address, the Honourable Andrew Giles, Member for Parliament and Commonwealth Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs. Please join me in welcoming the Minister.
Thanks so much, Byron. It really is a privilege to be asked to be part of this conversation this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. Can I start by acknowledging that I'm on Wurundjeri land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging here, and acknowledge any First Nations people and the land upon which all participants are engaging on this very important conference. Thank you, Byron, for sharing that story by way of introduction, which I think really effectively sets the scene for challenges that AILA has been responding to and which the profession and governments need to do a better job of responding to. Can I also say that it was a real privilege to catch most of the previous session, and if I can extend my appreciation to Amber, to Jim, to Joanna and Gavin for sharing their perspectives as law students, which I found fascinating as someone who now was a law student a long time ago, but also something that gave me a lot of food for thought as I think about the big picture challenge here of what we can do to shape a multicultural nation in which everyone belongs, in which everyone is respected and valued for who they are, and in which everyone has an equal opportunity to fulfill their potential, particularly their potential in professional life. I also want to acknowledge Ayla and in particular Melina, who has been a significant influencer in my thinking in this space and in this regard. So I am very pleased to have the opportunity to make a brief address to this conference as Australia's relatively new Minister for Multicultural Affairs and as I would put it, semi-reformed lawyer. I'm struck by looking at the agenda for the 2 days of this conference and its theme, Many Cultures, One Voice, the great aspiration of AILA, and also the diversity of engagement in the profession, what it is, how it's structured and how it might be. And I look forward to having the opportunity to engage further with AILA about the outcomes of this conference as we carry on our conversation. I am struck as a former lawyer by the data which tells a story that's not satisfactory about the state of the profession. And as a Victorian lawyer in particular, I noted the work of former President Sam Pandya in highlighting some of these issues within the Victorian profession as well. These are questions that need to be addressed. In my view, that needs to be led by the diverse voices in the profession, as well as through a more clearly articulated national framework for multicultural affairs. And briefly, I might touch on some of the aspects of that before turning specifically to some of the questions raised in the profession. I'm concerned, firstly, as Minister for Multicultural Affairs, to recognise that over the pandemic period, and indeed in the lead up to it, that racism has been on the increase in Australia, and to acknowledge particularly that the East Asian community saw the brunt of this, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic. That's why in opposition, we committed to a new national anti-racism strategy and have started rolling out that strategy in government, looking to both cultural change and to better investigate and interrogate the systemic and structural nature of racism in Australia. In my view, this is a necessary, although of itself far from sufficient, step towards building a genuinely equal society, which should be the cornerstone of who we are. I started my remarks, I'm sure other speakers did, by acknowledging First Nations people. What makes Australia unique is the sharing of this country with the oldest continuing culture in the world and people from every other part of the world. But that sharing is amplified by the fact that Australia is a majority migrant nation. More than half of us are either born overseas or with a parent born overseas. This should be an enormous strength, particularly as my friend and colleague Senator Wong often says, as does the Prime Minister, the diaspora communities that make up Australia today offer us such an advantage, located as we are in the fastest growing region in human history right now. That's something that we need to recognise. And again, a foundation stone for recognising that is better measuring our diversity. Australia remains a laggard in this regard, particularly in comparison to countries like Canada and the UK and the US that we often compare ourselves to as multicultural advanced economies. We've committed to a project working with community and demographers of better measuring our diversity. We've seen the importance of this through the pandemic, where often our ability to direct public health messaging was limited by poor data. But that also isn't the end of the story, because we simply don't know, without the work of civil society organisations such as the Asian Australian Lawyers Association, where there are gaps in attainment across institutions that matter, the legal profession being one, the parliament in which I sit being another. And one of the differences between the two is that it's relatively easy to work out, as one of the previous speakers did, that less than 5% of the parliament is of Asian Australian background, as opposed to around 18% of the Australian population. I am proud to serve in the most diverse parliament in Australian history, but I am concerned that we have some way to do to create a parliament that better mirrors the nation and makes best use of the talents and experiences that make up Australia today. For me, that's why this data piece is so important. It is fundamental, not just to understanding where gaps in representation and participation exist, but also to identifying the policy responses that can address those barriers. When we better understand who we are, we will have a better chance of leading a conversation about ensuring that we are fulfilling our potential as a fully reconciled multicultural nation in which everyone is valued, respected, and fully participates. The last significant piece of work that I'm committed to and working on at the moment is a framework review of our multiculturalism. I'm conscious that we haven't really done this as a nation since the 1990s, so there were attempts in 2012 and also under Prime Minister Turnbull in 2017. But fundamentally, we haven't worked out whether our national institutions supporting multicultural policy are fit for purpose. And that is in a world where the Australian community has changed enormously in that generation. I'm hopeful, and indeed I'm confident, that this body of work will assist some of the challenges that impact on the profession. And I'm also hopeful that the conversation and the dialogue between national government and indeed through the states and territories and the profession can mature and reshape a legal profession that better reflects the reality of the Australian community. It starts with a data piece, but also accompanies this with a cultural piece that can only be informed by a process of active listening And on that, that's why I was so struck to hear the concerns and experiences of a number of young law students, because creating an environment in which they feel comfortable and confident is fundamental to reshaping all the ranks of the profession. Ranks that clearly don't reflect the reality of our communities, and ranks which clearly need to, in my view, better reflect those. For the reasons that I've articulated, but also having regard to points that have been made by previous speakers, to ensure that everyone's experience is brought to bear in the practice of law. That's fundamental, I believe, to the achievement of justice broadly, as well as remedying a deficit in representation and a denial of potential in individual cases. The barriers that are discrimination, whether direct or indirect, obviously have an impact on the lives of individuals. But I think it's important to recognise too that they diminish us as a society. They diminish us by the stain they impose, but also by denying us the application of everyone's talents to their fullest potential. And I feel that particularly in the legal profession, but I temper that with the work that is being done by the Asian Australia's Lawyers Association in bringing people together, in creating the networking that this summit is in significant part about, in driving the conversation, in forcing those of us in positions of power and influence to think about the reform options and indeed the reform obligation. I'm very proud to have the opportunity to play a small part in contributing to this vital conversation, and I hope that part is constituted not just by these short words tonight at this conference, but part of an ongoing dialogue that is rich, rewarding and transformative. Thank you very much for having me this evening.